Julianne. Good morning, everybody. Well, you are all in for a treat, and that is that we have Nancy Dickson with us. And let me tell you a little bit about her. A book of Greek myths got her hooked on myth as a kid, but it wasn't until graduate school that she suddenly discovered myth outside the traditional Greek, Egyptian, Norse cluster, and her world exploded when she saw the variety of myths in the world. She's taught at several colleges and universities and lectured for Smithsonian, Johns Hopkins, and Rhodes Scholar. She was a non-traditional student who didn't graduate from anything until she got a BA after her children were born. She then dashed through an MA in urban planning and returned to the humanities for her PhD. Her dissertation is entitled Armed and Dangerous, the Figure of the Warrior Woman in Early Irish Saga Literature. We are very, very fortunate to have Nancy to introduce us to the magic world of Celtic myth with a series of 6 intriguing lectures. She starts today with answering the question, who are the Celts? Nancy. Yep. Oops.
First question is, who are the Celts? The present tense of the verb is a conscious choice because the Celts are still alive today in a way that many of the early civilizations are not. Even though I'd be willing to wager that more of the people in this room have Celtic genes in their background than Greek or Roman, I'd also be willing to wager that you all know more about Greek and Roman myth than you do about your own Celtic myth. So we're going to try to fix that a little bit today. As for Celtic myths and tales still being alive in the world today, if you listen to some of the folk tunes in Appalachia and other places, they come straight out of the Celtic past. Some of you may remember Fleetwood Mac's song, Rhiannon, the name of a Celtic deity. There are very few modern songs featuring Zeus or Athena. Like someone asleep in a trance, the Celts may have gone dormant for a while and stepped off the world stage. But beginning with the poets and writers of the Celtic twilight, their revolt against England, the economic advances that led to the Irish Tiger, the Celts have risen back into the world. Today, you'll find Celtic themes and myths in every bookstore, in movie theaters, online games, T-shirts figuring quotes from J.R.R. Tolkien and others. Now, just to make sure you're not in the wrong course, we will not be focusing on the Celtics. We will be focusing, on the Celts. Hard C, not a soft one. So nobody's leaving, you're all in the right class. The Celts were called barbarians by the Roman historians, because they often went into battle stark naked, except for a gold torque around their neck, their bodies painted bright blue, the heads of slain enemies decorating their chariots or their waistband, as you see here. And later the heads were placed on pikes in the area around their homes. For the Celts, the head, not the heart, was the home of a person's soul. And taking someone's head gave you that warrior's power. This, of course, is a modern rendition of a Celtic warrior. 3 civilizations shaped the modern European world: the Greeks, the Romans, and the Celts. The Greeks and Romans were linear, angular, and literary. They were known for their straight roads, geometric temples, where they worshiped and they wrote things down. The Celts, by contrast, were circular, as you can see in the lower slide, Hillfort, imaginative, and fiercely oral. It wasn't that they didn't know how to write. They did. But they believed that writing was only good for things that were not important. Bills, receipts, miscellaneous like that. But anything that was really important, like information about gods and goddesses, had to be passed directly from one person's head to another. As you might imagine, this predilection for the circular, the flowing, the natural, is reflected in the Celtic preference for threes. And I don't know whether you can actually see it on this slide here, but this is an image of a god, an antlered god, with 3 different animals: a deer, a boar, and a snake surrounding him. He's not balanced. He doesn't have equal things on each side. The Greeks and Romans, drawing a picture like this, would have made sure it was balanced and symmetrical, not the Celts. So most myth systems have numbers that resonate with their people. For the ancient Babylonians, it was 12. For the Navajo, it's 4. And for the Celts, it was 3. And over the next 6 weeks, you'll find 3s popping up all over the place. There were 3 equally powerful groups of people: warriors, druids, and poets. Goddesses often took 3 forms: maiden, mother, and crone. And one of the tests of a true king was his ability to see the sovereignty goddess, who was normally a beautiful young maiden, coming in the guise of a crone. Their artwork reflects this predilection for 3s, always slightly off balance. So, where did these Celts come from? The dark purple area here was the birthplace of a lot of early people. For those of you who were with me this summer, this is the birthplace of the Indo-Europeans, because people left here and went east and west, some to India, but we can see linguistic similarities in all of these groups. About every 1,000 years or so, a different group left this small area and spread out. It was as if there was a huge breeding pool located in the Russian steppes. And when they reached a critical mass, the gates opened and another group went pouring out. The Celts did not go east they went west. The earliest known Celtic settlement was in Hallstatt in Germany, what is now Germany, where there were salt deposits. The Celts mined the salt, which they used to trade with the Greeks and Romans for important things like wine. And if you remember your Roman history, they paid their soldiers in salt, so it was a good exchange. The archaeological record here is particularly strong because the salt preserved almost everything, including cloth and wood, which normally deteriorates. At the apogee of their influence, their reach extended across the length of Europe, from Britain to Asia Minor. And if you look down in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, you'll see this circular place called Galatia. Some of you may know about Paul's letter to the Galatians. He was writing to a Celtic tribe. So, how do we know what we know? We have the accounts of Greeks and Roman historians who were writing about their enemies. The major way they encountered the Celts was in battle. The Celts terrified them in the beginning because they whipped themselves into a frenzy before going into battle. The Romans were very orderly and they plodded along. Boudica was a warrior queen. She was the only Celtic war leader to ever defeat an entire Roman legion. We have a description of her from Cassius Dio, a Roman writer. I quote, "She was huge of frame, terrifying of aspect, and with a harsh voice. A great mass of bright red hair fell to her knees. She wore a great twisted golden torque." I know I've mentioned this word a couple of times, but it's a tight necklace that fits just right here. I'll show you some pictures in a few minutes. And a tunic of many colors over which was a thick mantle fastened by a brooch. We'll hear more about the Celtic women warriors next week. The earliest written account of the Celts came from the Greek historian Ptolemy, who was with Alexander the Great when a small group of strange-looking warriors approached the camp and asked for an audience with the king. Ptolemy describes them as unusually tall men with drooping mustaches, and in the images that we have, you can see these mustaches that have been grown to come down almost to their collarbone, each wearing a gleaming golden torque. So there's a picture of a torque and a couple of swords. These men were wearing brightly colored tunics, just like Boudica, that reached halfway to their knees. They carried long swords with finely decorated scabbards, which were attached to chain belts, while flowing cloaks of checkerboard green, the origins of the Scottish tartans, were fastened around their shoulders with enormous golden brooches. Strangest of all to the eyes of the civilized Greeks was below the waist, they wore pants. Unheard of. But if you're riding horses, wearing pants is going to be much more comfortable than just a tunic. For any of you who've ridden a horse, or those of you who haven't, you can probably imagine riding horseback, no saddle, no pants. So the group approached the astonished king and announced that they were Celts who'd traveled from the mountains of the west to seal a pact of goodwill with the victorious monarch. Alexander welcomed them and assured him of his peaceful intention toward them. At that time, he was looking to the east, not the west, for his next conquest. He invited these rough warriors to share a drink of fine Greek wine, but he was appalled when they accepted. but refused to dilute the wine with water, as was the Mediterranean custom. And in many places, it still is today, especially in the hot weather. Keeps you from getting dehydrated. Have wine, have water. One of the most important posts at any party back in the Greek and Roman world was the person who was assigned to dilute the wine. And if the party was getting too quiet, too staid, he'd hold back on the water. If it was getting too raucous and rowdy, he'd add more water. Important job, kind of like the bartender cutting people off today. After asking these visitors many questions, Alexander's final question was, "What is it that you fear the most?" "Nothing," said the leader of the band. "We are afraid of nothing at all, except maybe that the sky might fall on us." And we'll see that later with Cuchulainn next week when we meet him. The spirit of Celtic bravado has remained alive into recent years. On the morning of the D-Day invasion, Bill Millen, Lord Lovat's famous piper, wearing a battle-dressed tunic and the kilt of the Clan Cameron, stood on the bow of a landing craft, took his pipes out of their box, and started playing Road to the Isles to try to cheer the invading army. The music was amplified over the loudspeaker, and the tens of hundreds of fearful troops suddenly cheered. Millen led the commandos ashore at Juno Beach during the Normandy invasion. Unarmed, he marched fearlessly in front of the troops, playing a martial tune to inspire the men behind him. People don't change that much over time. Today, more than 2,000 years after Alexander's encounter with the Celts, Celtic culture is everywhere. Music, books, movies. You can watch high-stepping Celtic dance at almost any local folk festival, or see the spectacular Lord of the Dance at a huge amphitheater. In spite of what many of the Romans and Greeks said about them, the Celts were not wild, mindless barbarians. Their technologically advanced culture spread throughout what is now Europe, in many ways surpassing the Greeks and Romans. Did the Druids really practice human sacrifice? Yes, but they also believed in reincarnation. They studied the subtle movement of the stars and composed hauntingly beautiful poetry. Were their women really equal to men? Yes and no. It was definitely a man's world, but a Celtic woman had rights and powers that even Cleopatra would have envied. And a woman's behavior was not restricted by her birth biology. And we'll see more of that in coming weeks. So, long version, we're coming back to an earlier slide. The records of the Greeks and Romans give us one view of the ancient Celts. Another source of information is the archaeological record. Most of the archaeological discoveries from the 18th, 19th, and 20th century were made by men and interpreted by them in the context of the misogyny of the day. So if a burial included weapons, along with a skeleton, it was clearly the burial of a man. It wasn't until 20th century archaeologists began looking at the skeletons, and they found that many of these men buried with their weapons were actually women. For centuries, the early Irish stories of women warriors had been labeled fables. But what more recent studies suggest is that in the Celtic world, behavior, not biology, created gender. I'm sorry, my tongue is just out of bounds this morning. The archaeological record also reinforces the idea that the Celts believed that the head, sorry, that should have gone with Boudica. That's an example of a Celtic brooch. And let's see. We have the warrior here with his helmet, his sword, his shield, and his bare feet. And the animal chasing up and the animal at the top. And this craftsmanship is amazing. There's a close-up of him. I just love that facing down the, it suddenly reminds me of St. George and the Dragon, another British Isles tale. The number of statues where the head is the most prominent feature is almost equal to the number of carved heads who never had bodies. It's not that the body was cut off. The Celts really saw the head as the most important part of a human being. The statue here, the one in the lower left, is two-faced. And the statue on the front is obviously a man because he has male genitalia. The statue on the other side is female. And then the one on the right is one of the, it's very hard to get a picture of them, but the Celts have a number of heads that are three faces. And if you start moving on this one from the far left, you can see a nose and an eye and a nose and an eye and a nose. And across the bottom under the noses, there are three mouths. So if you turned the statue a little bit, there'd be another eye and another eye. This is a triple-headed person, God. Okay, the third source of information is the Christian redactors, the monks and scribes who copied down the tales of their ancestors while they were copying the classical and biblical texts. The eyes are just amazing. They look like they're coming right at you from 2,000 years ago. Now, while they were transcribing, particularly the biblical texts, these monks had a problem because they couldn't write anything that contradicted the Christian teachings, but they also wanted to transcribe the myths of their ancestors. So they fudged things and they hedged their bets. And one scribe sums it up very nicely. He wrote in the margins, "I, who have copied this history, or more accurately, this fable, give no credence to various incidents narrated here. Some things in the story are feats of devilish deception. Others are poetic figments. A few are probable, others improbable, and even more invented for the delectation of fools." So he'd covered his bets. So these monks, scribes, were really in a very early kind of catch-22. They couldn't do anything that interfered with Christianity, but many of their early tales flat out contradicted Christianity. In many instances, Celtic goddesses, particularly like Bridget, were just suddenly converted to saints instead of the goddess. St. Bridget's feast day is the same day as the goddess Bridget's day. Other effects of the Celts on Christianity will be part of the final lecture. Now, there are, of course, problems with all three sources. The accounts of the Greeks and Romans were written about their enemies. Imagine, for example, if our country's history had been written by Apache or Comanche historians, we'd be reading a very different book. The archaeological record is always open to interpretation based on the cultural norms and the training of the archaeologists. Christian scribes, well, I've just told you about their dilemma. Why don't we have a record from the Celts themselves? In part, as I said, because the Druids, the priests and keepers of the sacred knowledge, believed that there were things too important, too holy to commit to writing where just anybody could read them. Because they were primarily an oral society, memorization was valued. Poets, you may remember I said right at the beginning, were right there in a class with warriors and druids as the three most important members of society. Now, with all of those caveats, we will now turn to what we do know about Celtic and especially Irish myth. We know more about Irish myth than any of the other Celtic groups because the Irish scribes and monks were more industrious and more fortunate in what survived the Viking raids. The Celtic calendar followed the seasons. And I don't know whether you can actually see this, but at the top is the winter solstice, at the bottom is the summer solstice. And the equinoxes form the cross brace. And those were the major festivals of the Celtic year. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about them later. The spring and autumn equinoxes, when the days are the same length, divided the year. And the other way, the solstices, the winter solstice, when days are the shortest, and the summer solstice, when the days are the longest. Many of the Celtic stories could only be told in the winter, when the days were short, the nights were long. People needed to hear things. They weren't out plowing. Fortunately, we are currently in the winter season, so I can tell you stories that I wouldn't be able to tell you in the summer. Samhain, I know it doesn't look like it, it's the one at 11 o'clock, which has given us our modern Halloween, was the most important holy day, the festival when the boundaries between this world and the other were at their most slender, their most tenuous. The Celts didn't divide the world as the Christians do with heaven up here, earth and hell, the way the Norse do. For the Celts, it was all on an equal plane, and the other world was just right there. You could get into it by inadvertently walking through a mist into a cave, and we'll see some examples of people doing just that in a few minutes. The doorway to the other world is often into a she. The megalithic tombs were not built by the Celts. They were built by a much earlier civilization, but the Celts had to explain these somehow. So those were entrances into the other world, and some of the deities lived in these vast monuments. Sometimes a voyager could get to the other world by just sailing a little too far into the Western Sea. And the Christian monks continued this tradition, setting off in a small boat and trusting to God to take them where they needed to be. But however mortals enter this other world, they need to be very cautious because time and space do not function the same way in the other world that they do in the mortal realm. Mortals enter the other world at their own peril. The Adventure of Nera is one such story that takes place at Samhain. Alil and Maeve, king and queen of Connacht, were gathered with all their warriors in their fort at Cruachan. They had hanged 3 prisoners the day before and were now sitting about a boiling cauldron full of meat, drinking and waiting for dinner to cook. Alil rose and challenged the warriors. Whoever among you is brave enough to tie a withe, a supple twig, around the foot of one of the dead prisoners hanging on the gallows will have whatsoever he wishes from me as a reward, even my gold sword. Although even the bravest of the warriors was fearful of venturing forth at Samhain when spirits roamed the land, each of them rose up in turn and said, I'm not afraid of a dead man. I'll take up the king's challenge. But each returned to the fire a short while later, not having gotten anywhere near the gallows. Finally, one young warrior named Nera said, I will go and win the reward. He left the hall, ventured out into the darkness, and made his way to the gallows where the bodies were hanging. He picked up a supple twig and tied it around the foot of one of the prisoners. But each time he did that, it fell off. Finally, the dead man spoke up and said, you've got to put a spike into the twig and into my leg, otherwise it won't hold. Nera did as he'd been told, and the spike held the twig. Well done, Nera, said the dead man. Now, by your honor as a warrior, do as I ask. I was terribly thirsty when I died. Would you carry me to a nearby house where I can get a drink of water? Nera lifted the dead man off the gallows, hoisted him onto his back, and carried him to the nearest house. But when they got there, there was a ring of fire all the way around the house. My drink is not here, said the dead man. The hearth is always raked in this home. Move on to the next house. So Nera carried him to the next house, but there was a big pool of water surrounding that house. Do not go to that house, said the prisoner. There's never any water left in the tub after washing and bathing. Move on to the next one. When they reached the 3rd house, there was no water surrounding it, no fire. So Nera put the prisoner down. He entered the house and took a drink from each of the tubs that had been left with water. Then he spat a mouthful of water into the face of each of the people sleeping there. And they all died. And that's why you should never leave water from washing or bathing in the tub, or leave a hearth with a fire that has not been raked. So there's your lesson for the day. Then Nera took the dead man and hung him back up on the gallows. But as he returned to the fort, he saw Cruachan on fire, and the heads of all those who had been inside had been severed and heaped into a pile by enemy warriors who were just then leaving the fort. Nero followed them as they made their way into a nearby cave. As they entered the cave, one of them said, "There's a human with us." "Yes," said another, "I can feel his heaviness." Each warrior turned to the one behind him and repeated the news, so that soon they all knew that Nero was following them. When they reached the king of the Sidhe, he called Nero forward. "Why are you here?" "I came with your army. I saw the devastation your men had wreaked on Cruachan and the mound of heads of those they slew." The king said, "Go to that house over there. A woman lives there alone. Tell her I've sent you to stay with her. And you are to bring me a bundle of firewood every day." When Nero went to the house, she welcomed him. For 3 days, Nero carried his bundle of wood to the king's hall, and each day as he passed, he saw a blind man carrying a lame man on his back, coming out of the royal house. They would go to the edge of a spring in front of the house and stop there. "Is it still there?" the blind man asked. "It is indeed," answered the lame man. "Let us go back to the king." When Nero returned home, he asked the woman why the 2 men went to the spring every day. She said, "They do it to make sure Brian's crown is still in the spring. It's a golden diadem that belongs to the king." He blinded one of the men and made the other lame so they could be trusted to carry out his task. Nero continued to question her. "When I came into the Sidhe," he said, "I saw the fort of Cruachan burning and all its people killed. How did that happen?" "What you saw," she told him, "was a vision of the future, but it will come to pass unless you warn your people. Go now and tell them. You'll find them still gathered around the fire, and it's still Samhain. My king is planning to send men to destroy the fort, for it's been foretold that Alil and Maeve will ravage the Sidhe and carry off Brian's crown." Nero agreed to go, but said, "How will I convince them I've gone to the other world and not just up to the gallows?" The woman handed him some of the fruits and flowers of summer. Remember, Samhain is in the fall. Then she asked Nero to warn her when the warriors were coming to destroy the Sidhe, because, she said, "I'm pregnant with your son. I will take the king firewood myself every day and tell him you're sick." Nero returned to Cruachan and found his people still sitting around the fire waiting for him as if no time had passed at all. He told Mael and Alil everything he had seen and heard, and he showed them the fruits and the flowers as proof that he'd been to the other world. He remained in Cruachan for an entire year until Samhain came around again. Alil told him to go back to the Sidhe and to fetch his wife, his son, and everything that belonged to him. Soon afterwards, Maeve and Alil did attack and ravage the Sidhe, taking the crown of Brian and other treasures back to Cruachan. But they left Nero in the Sidhe along with his family, and there they will remain until the end of the world. Another tale involving Maeve and Alil, king and queen, begins in the human realm and during the summer. The 2 were lying quietly in bed, just talking at the end of the day, until Maeve suddenly says, "It's lucky for you that you married such a wealthy woman as I am, You are a kept man. Allele, provoked, said, what do you mean? I'm a wealthy man in my own right. I have just as much, if not more wealth than you do. And they were off and running with the fight. They woke the entire household. They had the servants bring out everything they owned, no joint property, and lined it all up. And at the end of all of this, they found that Allele owned a bull that Maeve had no equal to. So she went on the warpath to capture a bull that was owned by somebody else, that was the equal of Allele's bull. She recruited warriors. There was a massive fight. We'll be hearing more about this fight next week when we look at Cuchulainn. But at the end, many, many warriors were killed. And just spoiler alert, both bulls died. Got spirit for one more story? Good. This is a different sort of trip to the other world. It's called the Voyage of Bran. One day, Bran, a king, was standing by himself looking out over the water. He heard strange music behind him. He turned to see where it was coming from, but each time he turned, the music was always behind him. The sounds were so sweet that he fell asleep. When he awoke, he saw a silver branch with white blossoms in front of him. He picked up the branch and took it inside his royal hall, where a woman in strange clothing appeared suddenly, standing right in the middle of the room. As they stared at her, she began to sing. I'm not going to attempt it. I bring a branch of an apple tree to you from a distant land. Branches of silver are on it, and crystal balls blossom. There is a distant land, a delight to the eyes. Let Bran hear and begin a voyage. Perhaps he may reach that land. Suddenly, the silver branch sprang from Bran's hand. Even though he struggled, he could not hold on to it. And as he watched, it flew into the hand of the woman. As soon as she had the branch, she disappeared. Bran gathered 3 companies of 9 men each and set off on the sea in search of the land the woman had spoken of. When he'd been on the water for 3 days and 3 nights, he saw a man in a chariot coming toward him over the waves. The man said he was Manannán, son of Lir, one of the Celtic gods. And then he began to sing. Bran thinks he sails the clear sea, a beautiful place in his little coracle, kind of boat. But to me in my chariot, it seems he traverses a flowery plain. Let Bran row steadily onward. He is not far from the land of women, a place with many hues of hospitality. He will arrive before the setting of the sun. It wasn't long after this that they came to the island of women, where the leader of the women called out to him from the shore, Bran, son of Thebo, your coming is most welcome. But Bran was reluctant to land on the island, so the woman threw a ball of yarn at him, but she held the end of the thread in her hand. When he caught the ball, it stuck to his hand, and he couldn't let go. Then the woman slowly pulled him ashore. The women of the island welcomed Bran and his men to their home and took them to a large house where there were 3 times 9 beds ready, one for each of the men to share with one of the women of the island. A feast was made ready and placed before them, but as much as the men ate of the food, It never diminished. They stayed there for what seemed to be about a year, but in fact, many years passed. They had everything they might desire. At last, Necton, one of the warriors, was seized by a longing for home and begged Bran to take him back to Ireland. Finally, Bran gave in and the men prepared to leave. The women of the island warned him, "You'll regret returning home." But Bran wouldn't listen. "At least, do not let your feet touch the land," she cautioned. Bran left the island of women with all his men. They sailed and sailed, and at last they came to Ireland, where they saw a gathering of men on the shore. "Who are you?" the men shouted. "I am Bran, son of Feeble," he shouted back to the men on the beach. "That's impossible," shouted one of the men on the beach. "The voyage of Bran, who left this land, is one of our ancient tales." Bran's companion, who had wanted so much to return home, could not wait any longer. He jumped overboard, swam ashore, but the minute he stepped out onto the beach, he collapsed into a pile of dust like someone who had been buried for centuries. Now, when Bran saw what had happened, he stayed on the boat. He told all of those on the shore of the adventures he'd had, and then he bade them farewell and sailed away, never to be seen again. You know, there's an Alice in Wonderland feel to many of these stories. As you probably remember, Alice is sitting there quietly on the bank, watching the river go by, when all of a sudden a rabbit runs by. Nothing unusual, except the rabbit is wearing a waistcoat. Suddenly, the rabbit pulls his watch out, looks at it, and says, "I'm late." Alice follows the talking rabbit, and soon she's on her way into another world. I think we can see echoes of the Celtic stories in this. In the Celtic tales, there's usually a very normal beginning. Ailill and Maeve are gathered around a fire with their warriors, happened every day. Bran is standing by the seashore, gazing out over the water. If you're fortunate enough to live by the water, that's probably at least a weekly occurrence. Maeve and Ailill are lying in bed talking quietly like many husbands and wives. But then the world twists. The story turns, and we find ourselves entering a very different world. So next week, we will focus on the human realm and the cult of the warrior. Cuchulainn was the ultimate warrior, trained by mysterious women, given a weapon only he possessed, and which, once lanced at an enemy, never failed to kill. On the battlefield, he spurns the offer of help from the Morrigan, the goddess of battle, with disastrous results. Stay tuned. Questions?
Nancy, that was absolutely splendid. And we look forward to next week, the cult of the warrior. I wanted to say that for me, it was interesting to see you drawing the contrast between the Greeks and the Romans, but I think more important, you have given the Celts their due, and that is as a very rich and complex culture about which we ought to know more. So do stay tuned, and I'm ready to take questions.
My name is Ann Webster. Could you say something, if you know, about where those beautiful pieces of jewelry are, in which museums?
Well, the most beautiful, the one I talked about with the warrior,
Yes.
is in the British Museum. And
Okay.
the British Museum does have many, many of the Celtic treasures. They have the Sutton Hoo burial. There's also a good collection at the museum in Hallstatt in Germany. I can't remember the name of it, but the Irish Museum in Dublin has an excellent collection, especially of torques. There's one room that is full of nothing but torques. But you look at those and they've only got an opening this wide. Did they get them on?
And my other somewhat related question, the stones with the carvings mostly of faces, but where, I assume, I think there were at least 3 photographs. Are they each in different places?
I think the group of 3 was all in Ireland.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question here on Zoom or a comment. Phyllis, would you like to unmute and ask, or shall I read?
Yes, thank you very much. And I very enjoyed your talk. I've discovered I'm 40% Irish and we're going to Ireland in May. So I'm looking forward to that experience. So I'm curious about the relationship between the Scythians and the Celts, since they both seem to originate in the same space and time.
Yes, the Scythians and the Celts were both waves of migrants that came out of that area. I showed the slides of the central Russian steppes, and the Scythians, I think were a little bit earlier, close to the same time they came riding out. They were both horsemen. They both had domesticated animals, but the Scythians didn't seem to have the underlying culture that the Celts did. They certainly had a lot of beautiful jewelry and ornaments, but maybe they just weren't lucky enough to get the Christian scribes to take down their stories. Did that help?
Yes, thank you. So who introduced the war chariot? I mean, if they were both horse people, the introduction of the war chariot was like the modern tank. Basically, it assured them of victory in their wars.
Well, I think that once you have domesticated the horse and persuaded him that, or her, to do what the human asks, the chariot is a fairly short step. The Celts had chariots that were personed by 3 people. There was the charioteer, the person who rode in the chariot and did the steering, and then there was the helper who ran alongside. If the warrior standing up with the weapons were killed, the charioteer would come up and take his place, and the third guy would come onto the chariot until they'd all been killed.
Thank you.
Just keep going. They did not admit defeat.
Do we have other questions? Okay, well, we look forward to next week, and then I'll tell you why Nancy is such a good storyteller. I wondered whether it was by design or accident that you told us 3 tales.
Well, the Celts, as I said, did not write things down. Modern authors have taken the tales and transcribed them, but it seems to me that because I think this is important, I'm not going to give you a handout with a bunch of words on it. I'm going to tell you the story. My mouth to your ears.
Next week. Very good.